our next speaker will be Marta Bayer. Marta is a lawyer, it's telecom engineer, and he will talk about Hillary problems with emails.
Just a little, just a little.
And how telecom is really changing all the rules, changing elections. I don't know what is changing. So thank you, Marta, for coming again.
Thank you for having me. Thanks to both the SCTC for the invitation and for Cisco. Our friend from Cisco is not with us, but they are very definitely supportive of this event, and I wanted to acknowledge their participation.
Let me say, yeah, I am looking for. Sorry,
okay.
I am not very.
So I had the great privilege of being here last year, and if anyone, I've seen some people who were here last year. I brought one of my slides back, but the first slide in my presentation is of something that one of Augustine's sons asked me about yesterday. He said, "What was the coolest thing that you saw?" And I said, it was this,
yes,
which is the machine that will take a photo of you and create a chocolate bar of your face. Not terribly practical, but very cool. This is the slide that I created last year. And the question is, what do all of these people have in common? And the answer is, they changed the world for good. Last year, the next slide was of Edward Snowden, who changed all of our worlds. But this year, it's Hillary Clinton. Now, I'm not suggesting, this is not a political discussion. This is not, we're not going there. But I will tell you that for the Americans that are on the panel, we probably all voted differently. And it doesn't matter. First of all, we're all very good friends. That doesn't matter. But the second issue is it's important to put the Hillary email problem in context. We had two incredibly unpopular candidates running for office. No one liked either one. Not no one. Most people didn't like either one. And did the hacking affect the election? Well, it might have, but we all agree that the votes were not hacked. What the hack did was it created an opportunity for people to read emails that made one of the candidates look bad. Would you want your emails read? I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I think the incredible convenience of and efficiency that's provided by email and electronic communications has made us lazy. I heard someone say earlier, and I think, John, it might have been you, that perhaps we spend too much time on the phone. I don't think we spend enough time on the phone. I think we lose contact, and we come to rely so heavily on these electronic means of communication, which are great, but they're also vulnerable. So the next question is, what steps do you take to keep your information private? This photograph is of someone in a dumpster. I'm not sure how well you can see it. But a couple years ago, I think 7 years ago, Hewlett-Packard's board members had their trash shuffled through as people tried to look for corporate secrets. Now, they got caught, and it was a mess. But I think we tend to get very complacent, and the other lawyers in the room, I hope you'll jump in on this with me. We're too quick to rely on our email when, in fact, a phone from which there is no record can often be a more effective way of communicating. So in a corporate context, who's responsible for guaranteeing privacy and security? Well, it used to be the guy on the left. But now, in fact, it's really everyone. And responsibility for maintaining security, certainly from a legal perspective, falls not just to the IT department, but it falls to everyone. It falls to the finance people. It falls everywhere in operations, and I think we lose sight of that as well. This is also incredibly important. Simply because someone is a technical expert does not make them a security expert, and I think we tend to rely too heavily on the technical expertise and the technical experts who will say, "Oh yeah, I got it. I'll take care of it." No, that's really not that's not always the right answer. It can be, but it isn't always. These issues have become bigger than they're not simply limited to technology. So in the U.S., and I don't want to bore you with too much silly stuff, but there are 4 essential elements or entities, government entities that are involved in one way or the other with security and privacy. The NTIA, which is under the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Federal Trade Commission, which is very concerned about privacy, the Federal Communications Commission, and it's going to have a very big week on Thursday, and then finally the states. But as is always the case, there are turf wars, and whose responsibility it is to manage which portion of the issue remains a question. I found this painting today from Spanish artist Viviana Gonzalez Agate. Is that how you say it? Agate? Anyway, this is kind of a great illustration of it's not really perfect whose responsibility is what. It sort of all blends together and sometimes it overlaps. Very quickly, the NTIA, the U.S. Department of Commerce, is not a regulator. They do not get involved in the day-to-day protection and enforcement of the laws. What they do is try to advise the president and the administration about how technology should be used. I was in Washington last week at a seminar so that I could be smart when I came to speak to you. And one of the things that they kept saying over and over again is part of the NTIA's mission is to use the technology so that the staff, they're not regulators, but those who are involved in the creation of the laws actually understand how the technology works. So there are pictures of people on pogo sticks just because they're all testing them. The Federal Trade Commission is an equal executive branch entity to the Federal Communications Commission. FTC is an enforcement agency. They do bring cases, and they talked about some very interesting ones where consumers were led to believe that their data would be used for one purpose, and in fact it was used for something else. And they frown on that in the most serious of ways. Good. So the Federal Trade Commission has certainly used its muscle to talk about software security in particular, and making sure that they are encouraging entities, and that means government and business, to make sure that the right people are in charge, as I mentioned before. You do not want Pee Wee Herman managing the store. They also made a very clear point, which is sort of obvious, that you need to have a written plan in place. And I'll get to this in a second, but the fact is the plan should not be cast in stone. It should be something that is a living, breathing document. The Federal Trade Commission is very interested in conducting risk assessments. They provide oversight to service providers, and they are very concerned about the reasonableness of enforcement, not strict liability. That means something to the lawyers in the room. It may not mean anything to the rest of you, but a reasonableness standard is the conduct reasonable, where strict liability is a standard that says essentially if you're in this business, you're responsible. The FTC is very interested in identifying where there is a quantifiable harm. They don't care particularly if something functions perhaps not as intended, but there is no harm. But as soon as there is a harm, and that's for everyone to decide, that's for good lawyers to define, they are ready to jump in, and they will. Federal Communications Commission, in the last administration, the chairman was a gentleman named Tom Wheeler, who I believe was Tom, I think, and Augustine have met him. I have not. But under his leadership, the Federal Communications Commission issued new rules for ISPs, Internet Service Providers, and broadband providers regarding how they use information that they collect from their customers. Under the Wheeler administration, the FCC has said effective Thursday of this week, ISPs must give the power to consumers to determine how their information is used. The rules have not yet been stayed or stopped, but that could happen as early as tomorrow. There's now a new sheriff in town, there's a new administration, and the rules may change. And this is really important. The second point is really the key, because what the ISPs are first claiming that they shouldn't be the only ones who are responsible. Everyone should have to be treated this way. But the real underlying issue is the fact that they want to sell the data. They want to generate another revenue stream from information that they get from all of us for subscribing to their services. Interestingly, yesterday at the mobile, and this is not scientific by any means, I would say that there were 20 booths that wanted to sell data to everyone that was talking about security. So that data is incredibly valuable, and everyone wants their hands on it because it's valuable for marketers. Government entities at the federal level and at the state level both say, you know what, that's private. So we'll see where this goes, but this is a hot issue. In addition, states have very differing rules, and the picture on the right is of a crazy quilt because the rules from state to state are not the same. But all states tend to get very upset and have, not just get upset, but have rules and regulations in place in the event of a data breach. When the Target breach happened at Target stores, which I guess are not in Europe, but are certainly in the U.S., state governments got involved in addition to the federal. So there are a lot of different players, and everybody's sort of trying to figure out whose place is whose. Very quickly, when we talk about Internet of Things, there are a couple of important issues. There are lots of players in this space who don't have any experience managing technology. Ford Motor Company has always been in the car business. They are not in the IoT business. When you start looking at acquiring devices that have all sorts of sexy features, it's very important to understand, or to have your sales team understand, exactly what the ramifications are of what they're doing. They were not in this business. They did not grow up doing this, and it creates a lot of vulnerabilities. So there are three clear challenges to managing IoT devices. One of them is the ubiquitousness of data collection, right? Things are being collected all the time. I was a little afraid today when I went for my long walk and got lost that perhaps I would be seen on a camera somewhere wandering around in circles. I don't know if it happened or not. The second issue is that the data that is collected may be used for purposes for which it was not intended. If you agree, for example, to let your television provide information back to your ISP, suppose the ISP uses it for some other reason, like to sell you a dishwasher. Well, that's really not what it was intended for. It wasn't intended. As a consumer, there's a question of whether you should have the right or not to determine how that data is used. And then the last issue is that heightened security risk. There's a heightened security risk as devices become more complex. So it's something else to consider. Two categories of devices. Those with privacy implications like your television, and those without privacy implications. Not without vulnerabilities, but without privacy implications. And the second group would be machine-to-machine communications. We really don't care if the power grid in one location is talking to the power grid in another, so long as it's safe. There's no privacy issue. There are other security issues. Within the device management of IoT, you need to look at not only how it operates currently, but how quickly it can change based on how often the vendor supports the device. How often will it be? Will bugs be fixed? How often will bugs even be noticed? Okay. And then it's also important to know as a consumer, and I mean as a corporate consumer, how the data will be collected and how it will be used. The information that is collected is very valuable, and it is often a secondary issue or not even on the radar of the purchaser, but it is very definitely on the radar of the person who is selling the information because it's potentially another line of revenue. Who's responsible for the data that's being shared? These are, again, are questions that should be asked. There are no definite answers, but they're questions that need to be asked, and it's fair to assume that the account team that is trying to sell you some of these things will have no idea, but it's important to ask the questions. I love this picture of a network because each one of those nodes is a vulnerable spot. And I can't stress this strongly enough. You need to be aware where the vulnerabilities exist. As a lawyer, and in very small print at the top, I wrote, this is the kind of question that lawyers dream about. Where is the risk? Identifying it, defining it, and then also identifying not just the risk to the device connecting to other devices, but the risk to the device itself. A little Internet of Things trivia. It turns out, according to the Federal Trade Commission, that almost no one changes their default password, which exposes you to huge vulnerability. I asked everyone earlier, when was the last time you changed the password on your device at home? I haven't. We're incredibly vulnerable, and we don't even know it. Okay, I mentioned this already. Mature manufacturers of newly connected devices may not have the savvy to even know that the questions that should be asked. It is very important to challenge the manufacturer and the distributor of the products to make sure that they are more concerned about getting the product to market safely as opposed to getting the product to market. There's an important difference. There's a time difference. That's critically important. Secondly, the threats, and by the way, that's Boris Badenov, for those of you who watched Bullwinkle, one of my favorite arch villains. The threats and vulnerabilities are constantly changing, so it's not something that you can acquire a device that the manufacturer tells you is safe today. It may not be safe tomorrow. In fact, it's fair to assume that it won't be. There is no one best solution. And this creates more work for consultants, which is a good thing. But the fact is, every problem is different. It has a different solution, and the solutions are changing constantly. This is probably the most important thing that the Federal Trade Commission mentioned, that representative mentioned last week when I was in Washington. It is critical that security issues be considered not at the last minute, not just before the product is brought to market, but in fact from the design phase. Yesterday, Tom and I were speaking to someone from a vendor who was talking about API, right? And he said we build it in we look at it like a Lego building, and it has to come in at the bottom. And I thought that was a really great description. One more thing. I have a couple more things, but I'll be really fast. The issue of data minimization is another very important one. The critical collection of large amounts of data increases the harms associated with a breach. If you're a big company, the breach can cause much more damage than if you're a small company. And larger stores of data are more valuable to hackers than our small ones. Very few people want to hack your system at home. Everybody wants to hack the bank. And if a company collects and retains large amounts of data, there's a risk that the data will be used in a way that is contrary to what the customer was told how it would be used. This is an important thing to remember. A couple of quick questions. I think copies of this will be available, so I don't need to read them to everyone, right? Augustine, questions will be, this will be available. There's also a significant argument in Washington about who should do the regulation, whether it should be the federal government, whether it should be the state, or whether it should be the industry itself. And there are people who argue that industry can't regulate itself, and that's a whole political discussion, and we're not going there. But it's very important that everyone recognize that these are issues for which there are no easy answers. It's much easier to raise the questions than to provide good answers, particularly when no one will agree. Key regulatory considerations: privacy, security, transparency, and the value and ownership of intellectual property. And my very last slide is, who will regulate? And the answer is the crowd. Questions, or we'll have them at the end?
At the end, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My very last slide is of a café con leche, because I am not a coffee drinker except when I'm in Barcelona.